Hello, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our event. I'm Emily Malara, PhD student at Hacettepe University, and it's my honor to moderate today's conference. Before we start, I want to thank once again all those who made this event possible: Casa Italia, İtalyan Dostluk Derneği, and the Italian Language and Literature Department of Ankara University. Ankara Üniversitesi İtalyan Dili ve Edebiyatı Anabilim Dalı. You can follow the program of Casa Italian events on Casa Italia website, on Facebook and Instagram pages, and you can read all the news in the journal. Today, we have the honor of having Mario Thiago Paixão with us. Author of important poem books, today he will present us two of his work. With an intervention entitled Notes on Contemporary Poetry and Personal Choice, the case of İftira ve Diğer Gözlemler, and Estudo de caso seguido de segunda tentativa. İftira ve Diğer Gözlemler and Estudo de caso seguido de segunda tentativa are two important volumes of poems written by Mario Thiago Paixão, and İftira ve Diğer Gözlemler is the translation of his work by the translator Benji de São Matos Paixão. The author, translated Portuguese to Turkish by Benji de São Matos, includes Alberto Herrera, Fernando Pesso, Miguel de Unamuno. Before we start, I would like to introduce our guest. Mario Thiago Paixão was born in Lisbon in 1982. He studies Portuguese language and literature at the Universidade Nova de Lisboa, Lisbon Nova University. Between 26 and 2010, he dedicated himself to the publication journal Calema. I say, sorry. Among its publication, Sentimentos Sobrepostos, Retrajet de Outcast o Quarto Semhar, Estudo de caso seguido de segunda tentativa. Currently, Mario Thiago Paixão works as cultural and educational attaché at the Portuguese Embassy and represents the Comeus Institute in Turkey. He also teaches Portuguese at Ankara University. Please, Mario.
Okay, so thank you very much, Emily. And first of all, I would like to thank everyone at Casa Italia and also all the other entities that Emily just mentioned that made this invitation to me to talk a little bit about poetry, specifically about contemporary poetry, and also about my books, concretely my last two books that Emily just mentioned, Estudo de caso seguido de segunda tentativa, which is this one, and my fourth book and first in Turkey, İftira ve Diğer Gözlemler, which is this one. And both books were released recently. The first one, the Portuguese one, was released last September in Portugal on the occasion of the Lisbon Book Fair. And immediately after, in October, the Turkish one was out. So I would like to thank everyone once again, but especially to Emily, that will be our moderator today, and to all of you that are following this informal conference that we are going to start right now. Let me just tell you that in the end of the conference, you will be able to ask questions. So you can write your questions throughout the conference in the chat. And then in the end, Emily will pick those questions and then we will talk about them in the end of the conference. I won't be too long. I made some notes, but as you can see, it's not too big. So I hope you don't get bored and that you bear with me. Keep in mind that the title of the conference is Notes on Contemporary Poetry and Personal Choices, which means that I'm not going to try to be very academic or very technical. I am just sharing with you my view about the poetry that is being produced in the world right now, and what are, in my opinion, the key points that we should look for when we read contemporary poetry. So let's start. And it's a happy coincidence that we are having this conversation today on January 29, because it is the anniversary of the publication of one of my favorite poems all time, and in my opinion, one of the fundamental texts of poetry overall, which is The Raven by Edgar Allan Poe. This very, very important poem, and which is fundamental, as I said, was published in 1845, January 29, on a newspaper called the New York Evening Mirror. Those were, of course, very different times. There were times when poetry could be read on regular newspapers and would be available to the masses. The world today has changed, and it's in fact very, very different. It's a completely different world, populated by different generations with different aspirations, in which each generation is looking for their place as a whole, and each individual human being is looking for its place, doing so in different ways, in a more or less conscious way, in their generation and in the world in general. The polemical writer and psychiatrist and political philosopher Frantz Fanon once wrote that each generation must, out of relative obscurity, discover its mission, fulfill it, or betray it. This is a quote from a very important book of Fanon, published in 1961 in French, called, in English, the title would be The Wretched of the Earth. Let me repeat the quote for you. Each generation must, out of relative obscurity, discover its mission, fulfill it, or betray it. It's a very interesting sentence when we think about it. It proposes two attitudes and two possible outcomes. Discover its mission, it's the attitude number one, and fulfill the mission or betray it, which is the attitude two, with two possible outcomes, fulfill or betray after discover. Although Fanon was clearly not thinking about literature when he wrote this, it was a political text. The fact remains that each generation of writers faces this decision: find out its mission and decide what to do, how to act, how to proceed. What is our generation today? In my case, as Emily said before, I was born in 1982. So that means that I'm a very elder millennial. By definition, 1982 marks the beginning, the first year of the millennial generation, after which we have the Generation Z, the Generation Alpha, and many more will come. Although these are just labels, or these are just tags, one must appreciate that each generation shares a certain sense of kinship, sharing certain traits that, especially nowadays, transcend borders and physical barriers, as we live in a more and more globalized world, as we have internet, social media is very developed, and we are completely connected. How do we translate this idea of kinship to contemporary literature, and especially to contemporary poetry? The one thing all contemporary poets have in common is the fact that we all can practice the craft with freedom. Freedom is the ultimate characteristic of poetry today. When we think about the poetry that is written and published today, we immediately face an indisputable fact. There is a total absence of an avant-garde. It is not possible simply to check the progress of a dominant movement in literature, and in this case, in poetry, or even the 2 or 3 more advanced schools, because they don't exist. In order to find out what of interest is going on. In fact, the current impossibility of an avant-garde is one of the most interesting characteristics of our moments in time. We have passed the age of the great movements that led the progress of literature up to the 20th century. We have seen a lot of isms. In the 20th century alone, we had modernism, we had Dadaism, we had surrealism, and so on and so on. And it was possible to look to each of these schools and understand which school, which avant-garde is more dominant, which one is losing power. It was even possible to look to each individual school and see how it was developing inside. For example, in surrealism, started with Breton, but immediately after we could look to what Aragon was doing, and it was slightly different, but it was still surrealism. Or we could look to poets like Paul Eluard, that comes from surrealism and then diverges completely. Nowadays, this is not possible. Today, we are in a postmodern era of literature. There is no dominant ism, there is no avant-garde movement, and we, poets, are free to create freely. It's freedom on freedom. Facing freedom, the mission, if you remember Fanon's word that I quoted in the beginning, one has a decision to make. Embrace it, fulfill it, or betray it. But now, this decision does not belong to the generation, but to the individual artist inside its generation, as we live in a more and more individualized world without dominant movements. We live also in a time of dispersion. The great issues of controversy during the first half of the 20th century, diction, meter, and subject matter, and let me clarify, when I say diction in poetry, poetic diction, I mean the linguistic style, the vocabulary use, the metaphors, etc. Diction, meter, and subject matter are no longer that important, or not important at all. There is a total tolerance for experimentation with various dictions, meters, and subject matters. In fact, playing with contrasting vocabularies, high and low, archaic and new, technical and folksy, it's something that is interesting, and it interests many of the most important poets of our times. A poet today can, for example, mix certain linguistic terms that are more proper, more common in scientific journals, on pure science, together with colloquial language, and why not add some Shakespearean, words to the mix, and it can create something. No one will point the finger and say, this doesn't make sense, because today we live in a world that all of this can exist and coexist with freedom. Contemporary poetry can touch what it will. We don't judge poetry by its subject, but by the depth with which it treats the subject and the brilliance of the manner in which that is done. What I mean is, for example, a great poem can be a poem simply about a cat that is looking through the window. And that poem, with that subject matter, can be a better poem than something that is very elevated about love and very romantic, or not. So both things can completely coexist. The depth that we treat the subject eventually is more important than the subject itself. Instead of meeting upon points of controversy, we range widely in many directions. There is more tolerance than arguments about technical matters, and many poets seem to be writing for a smaller and more immediate audience, often regional or political in definition. This situation has implications for both readers and writers. As readers, this is a moment characterized by diversity, and we approach poets not for what they can contribute to the current states of art, nor by judging how they fit into a certain modern fashion, but by seeking to encounter the unknown other. Poetry is, in the end, where we hope to meet one another in an intimate way. For the poet today, and for the poet with ambition, this is a promising moment. No style or technique is so unfashionable that it is unavailable. No poet or period of our literary story is so untouchable that it cannot be learned from or borrowed from. All elements are in hand. We can read Shakespeare, we can read Dante, we can read Baudelaire, Allan Poe, and we can borrow from them without thinking, this literary movement doesn't fit today, because they all do. This is one of the main characteristics of contemporary poetry today. The poet is free to work along a broader front, freer than ever to touch the past as he or she pleases, to let himself or herself be influenced, moved, touched at will, to accept or reject, to fulfill or betray, and produce art from it. So basically, these were some notes, brief notes, about contemporary poetry. And basically, the idea that I wanted to pass to you is this idea of freedom, potential dispersion, fulfillment or betrayal of one's mission through the poem as a work of art. Now we enter the second part of the talk, which is a bit more informal, in which I'm supposed to talk a little bit about me, about my writing experience, and about my books. So I started to write poetry with an idea of publishing, which is not the same as writing. I started to write with an idea of publishing it, which is a decisive concept, at age 17. Obviously, I understood that nothing that I was writing when I was 17 was worth publishing. Those were times, those were years of practice, learning, discovery. It's a bit like someone that starts going to the gym, and you just start exercising until you feel like you reach your shape, your desired shape. This was 1999, the turn of the century, which was a particularly interesting point in time. The world had many questions. What would happen in the 21st century? And I'm not talking about conspiracy theories. No one normal would ever think the world would end. But the turn of the century was truly a defining moment for our contemporary era. And that had its reflection also in poetry, the poetry that was produced back then. Fast forward to 2005, and my first book was out. I have it in here. It's this one called Sentimentos Sobrepostos. And at the time I was studying literature at the university in Lisbon, and I felt that it was time to put something out there. Fortunately, my editor also thought that it was time. He thought that it was worth publishing, and so it was out. It was published, it was only one edition, the book sold out, and it's now out of market, and I have no intention to reprint it. It was a chapter that was closed. It was a first step, and once you start moving, you don't look back. At least that's what I believe. It's a book in which I experiment a lot with form, with subject, with language, with different concepts, and it's more like a collection of poems. It's not exactly a concept book, it's more like an anthological book. So I'm not going to actually read from it, but I will show you its inside so you can have at least a general idea of what I mean. So for example, in here, you can just glimpse a little bit of one of the poems, just for you to see the shape of it. So even the graphic mark is a little bit experimental.
Sorry, Mario, can you just try to make more clear the image, because I guess it's very interesting to see near to camera, so we can. Okay, thank you. Sorry.
Okay. So just for you to have an idea of what I mean when I'm saying I was experimenting a lot, because you had this sort of poems that are kind of like drawings in the page. You had, let me show you another one. For example, in here, it's an example of another poem that was more like an experimentation around concrete poetry, which is something that I don't do right now, but it's more like a drawing than a poem. And so that's why I said that this book was a bit experimental, and I was a little bit trying to find my way. Have a lot of different influences coexisting at the same time. And so it was more, as I said, an anthological collection of book, type of book, and less a concept book. 2 years after, so in 2007, I published my second book, which is called L'étranger de Outcast ou Quarto Sem Ar, which is this one. And this was a completely new experience for me. So this is different from the first one. It's a concept book. What we have here is 3 very long poems, with each page working as an individual poem itself, and each long poem connecting to the other one. My idea, and I don't know how well I succeeded on it, maybe not that well, was to force the reader to go back and forth in the book, creating a tide-like movement of reading, an idea of pushing and controlling the way the reader reads. That was what was in my head. The result is, of course, a different thing. The result is always individual in poetry, because the reader of poetry is, much like the writer, free to move through the book as he or she pleases. On the book, I go about identity and the idea of belonging and not belonging, of feeling like a stranger or a foreigner. Those are themes that stayed with me and that I frequently visit again and again in my poetry. After this book, I left Portugal, I moved to Paris, where I taught Portuguese at Versailles Academy. And a year later, I came to Turkey, where I represent the Camões Institute, which is the Portuguese institute responsible for the promotion of Portuguese culture and language. And I work as cultural attaché at the Embassy of Portugal, while at the same time lecturing Portuguese language and culture at Ankara University. Since the time I came to Turkey until 2021, more than 10 years passed, more than a decade, and I didn't publish anything new in these years. It doesn't mean that I wasn't writing. It just means that I didn't think that I had nothing new to say. And I felt that I had nothing to add to the global poetic conversation, so to speak. I strongly believe that one should publish when one feels that he or she can add something to the conversation. If it's just to have one more book, one more publication, for me, it's not interesting. Other people may do it. I don't think that if there is nothing new, it should be out there. So it was a personal decision of actually not publishing. In this period, I was, besides my regular work, I was directing a literary magazine based in Portugal called Calema, in which I published some of my poems, and in one of the issues, as a curiosity, I published the translation of some poems of Orhan Veli, who is by far my favorite Turkish poet, and it's still the only time that Orhan Veli was translated into Portuguese language. It is also a period where I traveled a lot. That is also important in my experience as a writer, with reflections in my poetry. I traveled all across Turkey, from to the south, to the southeast, to the Black Sea, to the Central Anatolian, Mediterranean, Aegean regions, to Istanbul many, many times, and also abroad, especially in Europe and the Middle East, for example, to Syria or to Lebanon. Traveling is important for me and for my writing experience because, and I know it is a cliche, but it's true, it takes you to the other. It's the fact that you go. It's your own movement. You don't receive, you actually go for and meet the other, the different one, the different culture, the different approach and way to see the world. That is something that I incorporate in my writing experience, the idea of entering the other. Fast forward to 2021, in the middle of the pandemic, I published then my third and my fourth books, one in Portugal, one in Turkey. I showed you before, so Estudo de Caso and İftira, which, by the way, let me just, in case you don't know Portuguese, most people don't know. So Estudo de Caso in English means case study followed by second attempt. Obviously, immediately you notice that case study is not your traditional poetic language. It's something much more scientific that you would find in a pure science essay as a title, case study. And the other book, İftira ve Diğer Gözlemler, which in English translates as Slander and Other Observations. So these two books were published in 2021. And I like to say, I always stress that there are two books because one does not translate the other. They are independent objects of poetry. Both books, Estudo de Caso and İftira, are what I like to call sibling books. What I mean is that they share DNA. Some poems being the same, and this amounts to roughly 40 to 50% of the book. And the remaining part of the book comprises a completely different set of poems. This concept of sibling books, it's something that I've been working in my head for a while. And now finally I had a chance to produce. Think of it as if they are two brothers or two sisters. They share the same parents, they share the same education, they have common values, they have common tastes, but eventually each one will follow their own path and will continue their individual growth. They will always have a lot in common, but they also have a lot of differences between them, differences that individualize them. And this is what I tried to make with these two books. I don't know if or how well I achieved it. That is up for the readers, especially to those readers that are able to read in both languages, which of course is a niche inside of a niche. Both books were published in a very close time period, the Portuguese one in September and the Turkish one in October, and both move between introspection and daring in an exploration of themes that intersect. Themes like sex, addiction, hallucination, death, in short, it's life. Both are, I believe, at the same time very urban and very organic. And also noteworthy are the many extra book links which open the door to a possible further study. There is music, painting, photography, film, a lot of things that influenced me, and the book opens the door to them. It's a sort of a web that is built in the books that moves out from the books and into the real world. One can follow a string and reach a place or not. Again, it's up to the reader. It's the reader that decides. First, if he or she decides to read, if he or she has the time to read, we live in very busy times, and after, he or she can decide when and where to stop reading and or not to venture outside of the book, following these strings that are left in the pages of the books. Finally, a couple of final notes. These works would never happen without my wife and my translator, Bengi, because not only she is my driving force, she is also the translator of my book into Turkish. And so she is some sort of a co-writer. And it's also a special honor for me to be translated by Bengi, because she has been translating a lot of very important writers into Turkish, among them writers that I admire a lot, like Fernando Pessoa, Miguel de Unamuno, Bioy Casares, José Eduardo Agualusa, so many very big names that I feel very fortunate to be inside that list. And as you saw, I used the term driving force and not inspiration, because I think that's the word, when we use the word inspiration, it gives the impression that writing poetry is a kind of something that comes from somewhere and falls on you. And that's not true. Writing poetry is not a ready-made product. It's not given to the writer. It's a craft. It's work. You practice and you get better. Like any other artist, the poet is a creator. It's not a vehicle. He is not a medium. The poet makes the poem happen. Last but not least, I need to thank both my editors, Jorge Resta from Glaciar in Portugal and Kenan Yücel from Anima in Turkey, because from the first moment that I shared my work with them, it was received with a lot of enthusiasm, and in a matter of days, in both cases, we reached an agreement for a publication. It's even more flattering to me because both of them are also writers, they are also poets, and so feeling that my works were being well received by my peers, it's something that made me very happy. So now I just hope that also the readers, also you listening to this talk live or afterwards, also have the chance to read the books. And I hope you enjoy it. So that's it for me for now. And so I'll pass the word to Emily and to you if there are questions.
Thanks, Mario. Thanks for your amazing presentation of the book, of your poetry, and share something about you. I have two questions. One is mine, and one I received. I will tell you that one I received. You mentioned living abroad and away from house affect your writing. How was living in Turkey affect in that sense? This is the first question that I received from a private message in the chat. The other is mine. I really want to know which was your literary model for your poems. Like if you have something in mind, for example, you talk about Pessoa or about Poe, about American and English poetries, but which was your model, especially for Iftira? Thanks.
Okay, so let's start with the first question. To say that Turkey, of course, Turkey influenced me a lot. I honestly feel I live in Turkey for more than a decade, so I feel very much at home in Turkey. I have a Turkish family. My wife is Turkish and her family is my family. So it's that personal level influences the way I see the world as well. And so obviously it influences my writing. Also coming to Turkey allowed me to discover writers and specifically in this case poets that otherwise I would not discover or I would not pay attention to. And I'm talking about, for example, Nazım Hikmet, which very sadly is not available right now in the Portuguese market. Once it was translated, it was actually translated many, many years ago by Saramago himself. But then that edition disappeared from the market. And so being in Turkey allowed me to be closer to poets like Nazım Hikmet, to pay more attention, to read more. And Orhan Veli, that I mentioned in my presentation, who is by far my favorite Turkish poet. And it's a poet that I didn't know at all. I just heard the name before, but I have never read before coming to Turkey. Without coming to Turkey, I would never read, mostly, for sure. And it's now this connects with your question, Emily. I don't have one poet that I follow or that I admire like that as a model. Honestly, I don't have. But there is, let's say, a large group of poets that I go back. Can I say? I think, for example, when I was writing İftira and Tudkaz, they were written at the same time. I went back to my favorite poets as I was writing. One of them was Orhan Veli. I love Orhan Veli because I feel like I share a lot with him in terms of subject matters because he is very urban. It's a city poet. He is very funny at times, very ironic, very satirical. And that is something that sometimes it's also made visible in my poetry. But there are many other poets that I look up to. For example, there is a Portuguese poet that it is my favorite Portuguese poet called António Ramos Rosa. He is sadly not translated into Turkish. Poetry doesn't sell, so publishing houses are never too eager to publish it. But António Ramos Rosa has a very special way to deal with words. He is, for me, first and foremost, a poet of good words, of good concepts, of choosing the right words to the right time in the poem, which is something very hard. It takes many years to master. And I feel like I'm very far from him, of course. I mentioned also Edgar Allan Poe as a big reference to me because he's the first very big Gothic name. And that is also important in the way I write. Also Paul Éluard, especially after or these last years, the after surrealism years, his political point of views, the way that it puts society in the poem is for me also very interesting. And a lot more. But not just one, not exactly one model.
Thank you so much. I have another question. Maybe if we have time, I would like to read for you.
Yeah, sure.
Can you talk about pandemic lockdown days a bit? Was that challenging creating for you, or you managed to turn it to an opportunity as a poet? Was a challenge or was a turn point? How you lived the lockdown? This is the question.
Okay, so it's a very good question. I don't think that creatively it made that much difference to me, to be honest. I wasn't writing more because we were locked at home, or less. So in terms of creation of individual poems, it didn't make that much of, I don't feel that much of an influence, but it was a turning point in terms of putting works together and give them a final shape. The fact that I was at home, that we were all on a lockdown, actually allowed me to have much more time to sit down and write on the computer. Most of the time I write by hand still. I'm a very old-fashioned person. Not always, but I write a lot also on my cell phone, on the notes, if I'm just walking and thinking about something. But then you have the other part, which is you have to take what you have and you have to pass it to a Word document. So being at home on lockdown helped on that part. It's not exactly the creative part, but the revision part, the less touches part. So it was, in the end, it was important to have this lockdown. It was actually a positive thing, the only positive thing, let's say, obviously.
Really, thank you, Mario, for answer to the question of our guest and to my question. I would like to ask to our audience if there are other questions. Maybe someone wants to talk. Okay. So I guess it's time to say goodbye. With idea received. So I want to thank you, our guest, Mario Thiago, once again. Thank you for your very interesting presentation. Thanks for your time and for your answer to our question. We hope to see you soon and in person next time. Thanks to our audience, and I would like to invite you once again to follow all the events in program on the Casa Italia website, on Facebook and Instagram. For those wishing to purchase the Mario Tiago volumes, they can click on the link in their chat or contact the author directly by mail. Link and mail are in the chat I wrote before. So,
okay. Perfect. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and thanks all.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for having me, and to all that made questions or not, that just were here. Thank you very much.
Thank you.